Peki mai rā, kake mai rā, humai te wai ora ki ahau. E tu te hu ana te moe te kuia te pō a waira ka i rara wai. E papaki tu ana te tai ki tarenga, kā pō, kā e, kā wate. A ti hei mori ora, ko te mea tuatahi, me tūkua ki tō tātou kaihanga. Ko e hoki i tō tātou kai whakawā. Ko e hoki te timatanga me te whakamutunga o ngā mea katoa. Ko te mea tuarua, me ku whakaranga tira haere koutou ki tō tātou kaihanga. Nana koutou e manaki, e tiaki tātou katoa. Ku tai tonu te rā tātou ki a tātou. Nō reira, haere koutou, haere, haere, haere. Ako huri o ki hungo ora tātou katoa ku tai mai nei. Ki tēnei wā, a hui, o whakahiriari o tātou. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora koutou katoa.
Nā mihi miharo ki a koe Sid Kepa e te rangatira. Tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, kua tai mai nei. Ko tēnei te mihi ki te mana whenua, ko te atiawa me tāra naki whānui, tai atu ki naki tō rangatira. Ko waiau, ko mai, no airani, no inarani, no putarani, o ku tūpuna, nā reira ko tangata tōkiti ahau. Mo tamaki na kaurau, I whanau mai, hei kurua bei tōku kahanga nai nei, course about luck, tōku inga, ko reira, tēnā koutou, So greetings and solidarity wishes to you all gathered here in this early morning for this LHP Project Symposium. So I have the really wonderful privilege of being the chair of an amazing committee of people who have worked collectively to organise this event through COVID levels of one kind and another, through trials and tribulations. And on that note, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the ways that COVID has impacted our lives and all of our connections, our whānau, our loved ones, the dear friends that we have across the world who are dealing with all of the different things that COVID has brought. Look, I think we sometimes try to normalise it too much here, and I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge amazing committee of people who have organised this event today. Particularly our ringawera, Louise McCurdy, who is the behind-the-scenes person in the kitchen today, so is the essential worker of our day. And I also want to acknowledge Dean Broughton for coming in and being her able assistant. Always important to have those. But if I could have the other committee members stand up who are here today. I just want to acknowledge what a wonderful group of people you are to work with, especially when things go wrong. And our venue has to change 2 days before this event, and all of those things, and all of the work that all of the mahi that you've done to bring us here today in this room. So, ngā mihi, ngā mihi, ngā mihi. Kia koutou. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome my dear colleague and neighbour, Jim McAloon, to the stand.
Tēnā tātou e whakatira ngā it's good to be here. Thank you, Isabel. Thanks, everyone. I was asked to sort of set the scene a wee bit by talking about the background to the 1980s. I thought it was useful to put it in terms of the end of the post-war period, the end of post-war. I mean, I know it's a generalisation, but what I want to suggest is the whole set of assumptions and institutions and frameworks shaped economic, political and social life in Aotearoa as elsewhere over the 30 years from the end of the Second World War and that all these arrangements in various ways began to fracture, fragment and break up. And by the early 1980s, I guess the question was what would emerge? How would these tensions, conflicts, crisis if you like, be resolved? Well, we know the answer to that, but I think it's worth looking at a bit of the background. It's going to be a very quick scoot through, of course. I used to teach a whole course on what I've got 20 minutes for, so there we go. Now, on one level, putting the 80s in context, it would be tempting to focus upon Muldoon in all his intimidating glory. He is part of the story, but he's far from the whole story. I guess the other point I want to make is that there's perhaps a wee bit of a tendency to look back on the post-war years, at least among many people, as some sort of, if not utopia, at least, relatively benign period. And again, I am probably not saying anything unusual or new to many here when I suggest that sort of idea of a utopia really does need to be questioned and taken apart. Because, the post-war consensus, if it's useful to talk about one, was begun by the first Labour government, 1935 to 49, and crucially it was embedded by the first National government from 49 to 57. And that meant that it took on a rather more conservative cast in many ways than possibly might have happened. We don't know. I'm not a big fan of counterfactual history, but what emerged was a form of conservative mixed economy which most of the National Party could live with and perhaps even benefit from. So if the regime that emerged at the end of the war in New Zealand as elsewhere in the Western world was a historic compromise between capital and labour, it was also, and I think even more importantly, shaped by fault lines of gender, ethnicity, race, if we want to use that word. In Australia and New Zealand, it's been called a wage earners welfare state, and that meant, of course, a male breadwinner. Much of Labour's social policy was cast in those terms to appeal to the dominant ideology of the male breadwinner. This 1938 election poster, I think, puts it beautifully. You'd almost think that women had not had the vote for 45 years with that framing. But Melanie Nolan has said that both political parties engaged in a sort of arms race over domesticity. Who could do the cosy fireside better in the post-war years? And she's quite right. So the basic wage was cast in terms of the male breadwinner, the dependent non-earning wife, and 2 or 3 children. And as you know, equal pay was not even formally introduced in the private sector until 1977. The rapid increase in jobs for married women from the 1950s, again to refer to Melanie Nolan, was very much structured around part-time work because reproductive work remained in theory as well as in practice the province of women. But there's a contradiction there right from the start, that the ideology is of domestic duties, the reality is very different. A good deal, of course, has been said about the 1938 Social Security Act. It's extending coverage for sickness, unemployment and old age, but the benefits were less universal than the language suggested. You had to be receiving an income to qualify for sickness or unemployment benefit, and the full age benefit was means tested. So if it was a wage earners welfare state, it was also a welfare state directed to the heterosexual nuclear family. It was taken for granted at the time, of course, but now we need to make that point. If the family benefit introduced in 1946 of 10 shillings per child per week paid directly to the mother could be seen as a recognition of reproductive work as women's independent income, and many said that it was the first they'd had since they married. Then again, that independence, partial independence, could be signed away from the late 1950s when it became possible to anticipate the family benefit for a house deposit. So again, there are contradictions around gender in that measure, which is often looked back on quite fondly. There was, of course, as we all know, no support for divorced parents bringing up children, and recent revelations about the abuse of vulnerable children in state and religious institutions, of course, severely challenge those cosy ideas about New Zealand being a good place for children. It was a good place for children in a nuclear family with stable employment, and even then not always, given the hidden nature of domestic violence. The post-war years are also recalled as years of full employment, but again it was full employment qualified by gender and ethnicity. While there were plenty of jobs, indeed from 1947 until 1974, government-assisted immigrants from Britain alone totaled 77,000. Immigration was discriminatory, and this Labour Party advertisement from 1946 I included just to show the heavily racialised discussion in politics. Labour is attacking the national opposition for its suggestion that New Zealand might be opened up to imported goods from Southeast and East Asia, particularly Japan. The language does not reflect much credit, I'd have to say, on the authors of the advertisement. But this idea of New Zealand as a white settler country persisted in immigration policy. New Zealand was heavily sold to British migrants. British and Irish enjoyed open access until 1974. Other Europeans were sometimes admitted, but as we all know, non-Europeans to a large extent were not welcome. The exception, especially from the early 1960s, was Pacifica migration, and I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Employment relations were, as you will all know, also highly regulated. In 1936, the Labour government legislated for compulsory union membership in all occupations under the jurisdiction of the arbitration court. And the pros and cons of that were debated by unionists and workers at the time and afterwards. Even that great Labour loyalist Jim McAloon from Christchurch in the Legislative Council was very cautious of that legislation, fearing that it would bureaucratise the unions and destroy them as a mass organised movement. Whether he was right or not could be debated. But reinforced by the tightly managed economy of the Second World War, the arbitration court's reach over wage fixing expanded as well. In 1940, it was given the power to issue general wage orders, universal increases that applied to all workers under its jurisdiction. And the process was that usually the Federation of Labour would apply for a general wage order of so much. Government, employers, and possibly other interested parties would give evidence to the court as well, and it would bring down a determination. And perhaps that's a good point to begin talking about the slow end of the post-war settlement, the nil wage order of 1968. Brian Easton says that New Zealand's long post-war boom ended on the 14th of December 1966. That was when the wool sales for that year opened and the prices were disastrous. Now, New Zealand's economy was still largely built around exporting wool, meat and dairy produce. The British market had been declining for more than 10 years, but it was still major. Plenty of people in government and unions appreciated the need to diversify both what we exported and to where. Well, the wool crash triggered a fairly intense but relatively brief recession in 1967. Keith Holyoake's national government responded to it by cutting public spending, including the end of school milk 2 months before I started school, so I never had that defining experience of baby boomers. And also tried to push a more export-oriented economy, which had been under discussion anyway. For Holyoake's government, that meant reducing ordinary people's spending power so that demand at home would not take up goods that could be exported, and it meant devaluing the currency to privilege exporters. Many of you will know that the arbitration court in 1968 was persuaded by the government to bring down a zero wage increase, the infamous nil order. The result was massive protest by workers and others, and there's a photograph at the left there of a mass meeting of workers in Auckland, who correctly observed that they were being expected to take the cost of reshaping New Zealand's economy. And then, after a fair bit of backroom manoeuvring and a couple of months of reasonably intense protest and industrial action, the employer's representative on the court switched sides and agreed with the union's formidable Archie Grant to get the case reheard and give a 5% general wage order. Archie Grant, of course, as the workers' rep, had dissented in the first place in his usual thundering language. Well, the usual interpretation, Muldoon, who was newly appointed Minister of Finance, Muldoon called this an unholy alliance. The usual interpretation is that the success of that campaign emboldened the union movement and instilled in them a preference for direct action. There's perhaps some truth in that, but equally, government of both stripes right through until 1984 sought to manage wage growth, proceeded on the assumption that wages were the principal cause of inflation, which was increasing to unprecedented levels, and it proved impossible to develop a wage-fixing system that all parties could live with. But of course there's a lot more to it than that. Over the 20 years from the end of the war, New Zealand's economy had grown at a rate, like most other Western economies, whereby the tensions could be smoothed over. If there was enough to allow growth in real wages over those years, capital got an even greater share of the national income. And by the mid-1960s, unions, many workers were becoming well aware of that indeed. And while the Finton, Patrick, Walsh generation of trade union leadership in the FOL had been prepared to rely on quiet deals with politicians, both Walsh and his successor Tom Skinner at the top right there operated in that way. Skinner's Sunday morning gins with Muldoon became infamous as an approach to management of relations. But the later 60s saw a younger generation of workers and of unionists who saw less reason to accept a back seat, especially given continuing full employment. This was an international trend, but it's worth mentioning that in New Zealand a number of prominent veterans of 1951 began to take up senior roles in the union movement. Bill Anderson on the right, Jim Knox in the centre, and Toby Hill on the left. Or perhaps in the case of Knox and Hill especially, rebuilt their careers. And these folk had long memories. The global economy was changing by the end of the 1960s as well. In simple terms, I guess the overwhelming force of United States economic power in 1945 underpinned a certain form of global capitalism through to the early 1970s. And one dimension of that was an international monetary system in which most currencies were pegged to the American dollar, and in turn the United States guaranteed that any foreign government could swap its holdings of dollars for American gold at a fixed rate. That was all fine as long as there weren't too many dollars outside the United States and as long as nobody actually tried to cash in. But once the flow of dollars outside for various reasons, and once certain European governments did start to cash in, things became unstable, and in August 1971, President Nixon unilaterally ended that guarantee and brought the post-war monetary system to a halt. Photograph of Nixon and his Treasury Secretary John Connolly at about the time, and Connolly is he expressed it with admirable clarity, and I've included it also because it makes the point that Donald Trump is nothing new. My view is that the foreigners are out to screw us, said Connolly, and therefore it's our job to screw them first. So that was the background to the end of the international monetary system in the early 1970s. Global economic power was becoming multilateral, but Nixon kicked off big uncertainty and stress. Now, most of you will know that the United Kingdom joined the European Economic Community, the EU, in 1973. It's often said that that was a huge shock to New Zealand. I've always thought that it was more psychological than real, because the hard yards in breaking our dependence on the British market had very largely been done through the 1960s. The real bang in 1973 was the war between Egypt and Syria versus Israel in October of that year, the Yom Kippur War, and the resulting massive increase in the price of oil. Western economies based on cheap energy and compliant oil producers crashed into recession, and New Zealand went with them. So on one level, the decade after 1973, after the first oil shock, was an argument, as it had been in 1968, about where the costs of an economic transition would fall. Both major parties believed that the solution was a more export-oriented economy, with both a greater diversity of markets and, crucially, of export goods as well. To an extent, I think Bill Rowling's Labour government tried to keep workers' spending power at a reasonable level, but that, of course, was defeated in 1975, and Muldoon bluntly intended to squeeze wages, cut public spending, and revitalise the power of capital. And that is the background to a good deal of what we're going to be discussing through the rest of today. There was, of course, a lot else changing in the 1970s. I mentioned the baby boom already. It's worth noting that it came to a screeching halt in 1961-62, immediately that the contraceptive pill was introduced. And that suggests to me that women were looking to change things anyway and to control their fertility, that the demand was already there. And the flow of that went into work, into relationships, into sexuality, into gender. And most people here will be familiar with the intense arguments of the 1970s about fertility control, especially over the right to abortion. The working class was changing too. As well as becoming more female, it became more Māori and more Pacifica, and again, these dimensions are well known. But it's worth noting that this didn't just happen. It was about power and control. So there were explicit state policies from the end of the 40s to encourage Māori to move into towns, and explicit policies designed to assimilate them. Now remember the infamous pepper potting, the idea that Māori and Pacifica families should be distributed rather than allowed to form communities in public housing. Capitalist expansion needed workers. Māori and Pacifica people fitted the bill in certain sectors, especially as Pacifica workers, being in case of Samoan and Tongan people, immigrants subject to control, were an ideal, I still find the phrase reserve army of labour, were ideal in that sense. And this is also a dimension, of course, of New Zealand's settler imperialism in the Pacific. But there's always unintended consequences, and the demands among Māori around land, language, employment, culture, rangatiratanga, such as perhaps most visibly in the 1970s, issues like Takaparafa, Bastion Point, and the issues confronted by Pacific peoples, the infamous Dawn raids, the increasing questioning of disadvantage and of their subordinate position in the workforce. All this shaped the 1970s as well and contributed to dealing a fatal blow to the increasingly stretched post-war settlement. I've often thought that Muldoon's ideal world was the 1950s. He himself said as much. I grew up, he said, I lived in a very good time in New Zealand. He's perhaps an easy target now, but his good time was white with a dash of Māori if they knew their place. It was domestic. It was strictly gender oriented, gender divided, and so on. A fair go for the decent bloke, and the gender term again is instructive. I don't want to go off on a tangent, and I won't, about 1981, but one of the most perceptive analyses of the 1981 Springbok Tour protest movement, as Jeff Fougere wrote long ago, makes the point that the protest was as much about Aotearoa in all these dimensions as it was about the iniquities of apartheid. So things were changing. They were changing fast and they were changing profoundly. And the question in the early 80s was, in what direction would things go? How would these tensions be resolved? And that's what we'll be looking at today. So, kia ora tātou, thank you very much.